Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into a different kind of story. Not the simplified versions you might remember from school textbooks, but the full, layered, contradictory truth of one goddess whose influence shaped how Western civilization thinks about love, beauty, desire, and the dangerous territory where all three intersect. You won't find neat moral lessons here or sanitized romance. Just a life built on divine beauty, overwhelming power, jealous rages, genuine devotion, and the understanding that love, in all its forms, can save you or destroy you, often in the same moment. If these ancient Mediterranean tales help you drift into dreams, you can like and subscribe, but only if they truly calm your mind. And if you'd like to help our Peaceful Mythology channel grow, your support means more than you imagine. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, the time on your clock, and if you still have a little sleepy energy remaining, send it our way. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same slow exploration of gods and their endless complications. So dim the lights, let the sound of ancient waves fill your imagination. Settle in, and let's begin with the violent, beautiful birth of desire itself. The birth from sea foam and the weight of contradictions. There are two stories about how Aphrodite came into existence, and the ancient Greeks themselves could never agree which one was true. Perhaps the disagreement itself tells us something important. She has always existed in contradictions, has always defied easy categorization, has always been more complicated than people wanted her to be. One story is political and orderly, placing her firmly within the structured family hierarchy of Olympus. The other is older, stranger, more primal, reaching back to a time before Zeus claimed dominion over heaven and earth. The more famous version, the one that inspired countless works of art, and gave us the image most people carry of Aphrodite today, begins not with her, but with blood and betrayal and castration. Long before the Olympian gods established their palace on Mount Olympus, before Zeus even existed, the universe was ruled by more primordial powers. Gaia, the earth herself, vast and nurturing and terrible, gave birth to Uranus, the sky. Together, they created the first generation of divine beings, the 12 Titans, enormous, powerful entities who would themselves become parents to the gods we know better. But Uranus was afraid of his own children. He saw in them the potential to overthrow him, to take his power, to reduce him from ruler to memory. So he prevented their birth by pushing them back into Gaia's body, deep into the caverns of earth, refusing to let them emerge into the light and air. The pain was unbearable. Gaia suffered under the weight of her imprisoned offspring, feeling them struggle and press against her from within, unable to help them, unable to give them the life they deserved. Her agony went on for what might have been eternities. Time moved differently in those early ages. Finally, Gaia could endure no more. She took the hardest substance she could find, adamant stone, and forged from it a great sickle with jagged teeth, a weapon that could cut through anything, even immortal flesh. She called to her children in their dark prison and asked which of them would help her, which of them had the courage to strike back against their father. Most were too afraid, but the youngest son, Cronus, agreed. He was cunning and ambitious, and he saw in his mother's plan not just liberation, but opportunity. One night, when Uranus descended from the heights of the sky to lie with Gaia, spreading himself across her as the heavens spread across the earth, Cronus was waiting. From his hiding place, he reached out with his left hand to steady himself, and with his right hand raised the sickle his mother had made. In one swift, terrible motion, he castrated his father. The severed genitals fell through the air, still warm, still infused with the creative power of a primordial god. Cronus, disgusted by what he held, hurled them far out over the sea. They struck the water somewhere near the island of Cyprus, that crossroads between East and West where so many cultures would later meet and blend. The moment the divine flesh touched salt water, something remarkable happened. The sea began to churn and foam. Blood mixed with brine. The creative essence of Uranus, the fundamental generative power that had sired the Titans, began to react with the primal element of water. White foam spread across the waves, gathering, thickening, taking on substance and weight. Within that foam, impossible and inevitable, a woman was forming. Not growing from infancy as mortals do, not being crafted by divine hands as a sculptor shapes clay, but simply becoming, existence asserting itself. The foam clung to her like a wedding dress, like armor, like skin. As the waves carried her, she emerged, fully formed, fully aware, more beautiful than anything that had existed before in all of creation. Her skin held the luster of sea spray catching sunlight. Her hair moved like water itself, flowing and curling with a life of its own. When she opened her eyes for the first time, they held depths that could drown the unwary. Green and gray and blue all at once, changing like the sea that had birthed her. The currents carried her gently, as if the ocean recognized something precious and treated it with uncharacteristic care. She drifted first toward the small rocky island of Cythera, jutting from the sea south of the Peloponnese. The waves brought her close to shore, and for a moment it seemed she might land there. But the sea had other plans. The currents shifted, and she was borne onward, westward, across open water, until she came at last to Cyprus, that larger island where east meets west, where Phoenician traders mingled with Greek settlers, where mystery ran deep in the hills and ancient worship filled the groves. Here, finally, the foam-born goddess stepped onto dry land. Where her feet first touched the sand, grass sprang up, impossibly green and lush. Where she walked, flowers opened, roses and myrtle, and blooms that had never existed before, but suddenly seemed always to have been waiting for this moment. The island itself appeared to welcome her, the earth warm beneath her feet, the air sweet with fragrances that would forever after be associated with her presence. She was not alone for long. Before she had taken more than a few steps, two figures appeared at her side. Eros, the god of desire, and Himeros, the personification of longing, manifested as if they had been waiting in invisible form for her arrival. In some tellings, they were drawn into existence by the same cosmic force that created her, aspects of her power given independent form. In others, they had always existed, but had been incomplete until she arrived to give them purpose and direction. However it happened, they became her constant companions, her heralds, the physical embodiments of the power she carried within her. Together, this strange trio made their way toward Olympus, toward the gathering of gods who already knew, through whatever senses divine beings possess, that something significant had happened, that the cosmic order had shifted, that a new power had entered the world. As Aphrodite walked toward them, she carried with her a gift, or perhaps a weapon, the ability to inspire overwhelming desire in any heart, mortal or immortal, the power to unravel the strongest will with nothing more than a glance or a smile, the capacity to make rational beings forget reason and chase after what they suddenly, desperately wanted. The gods named her Aphrodite, from the Greek word aphros, meaning foam, acknowledging her unusual birth. Cytherea, after the first island that had almost claimed her. Cyprus and Cyprogenes, after her true landing place, Cyprus, which would become her most important cult center. And they gave her an epithet that the ancient Greeks used without embarrassment, but that modern translators uncomfortable, Philomedes, which means genital-loving, or born of genitals, a frank acknowledgment of the body part that, in a very real sense, given her life. The Greeks were not shy about such matters. The body, its functions, its desires, all of it was natural and worthy of acknowledgment. But there is another version of her birth, simpler and more conventional, that places her firmly within the Olympian family structure. Homer, in his great epics, identifies Aphrodite not as phone-born, but as the daughter of Zeus, king of the gods, and Dione, who was either an ocean nymph or one of the Titanesses, depending on which source you consult. In this version, there is no violence, no castration, no miraculous formation from sea foam and severed flesh. Just another divine child born to Zeus, who fathered so many children with so many mothers that one more hardly seemed remarkable. This version makes Aphrodite Zeus's daughter, one of his many offspring, and places her firmly within the complex web of family relationships that defined Olympian politics. In this telling, she has a mother who cares for her, who appears in her work to comfort Aphrodite when she is wounded during the Trojan War, who treats her not as a cosmic force, but as a beloved child who needs protection and nurturing. It's a more domestic, more comprehensible origin, and it fit better with the kind of theology that developed as Greek religion became more organized and priesthoods more established. The two versions are completely incompatible. She can't be both the daughter of Zeus and the product of Uranus's castration. The chronology doesn't work. The parentage doesn't work. The entire cosmological framework differs between the two stories. This bothered ancient people just as it bothers us. They liked their myths to cohere, to fit together into a single narrative that made sense. Some tried to reconcile the contradiction through various means. The philosopher Plato, always eager to find deeper meaning in mythology, came up with an elegant solution. There must be two Aphrodites, he suggested. The Aphrodite Urania, the heavenly Aphrodite, was the one born from Uranus and the sea, and she represented higher spiritual love, the kind of love that elevates the soul and points towards ultimate truth and beauty. The Aphrodite Pandemos, the common Aphrodite, or the Aphrodite of all people, was the daughter of Zeus and Dione, and she represented earthly, physical love, the love between bodies, the desires of flesh rather than spirit. It was a clever distinction, typical of Plato's tendency to divide experience into higher and lower categories. Whether regular worshippers accepted or even knew about this distinction is debatable. Most people who prayed to Aphrodite probably didn't spend much time worrying about whether they were addressing the heavenly or earthly version. They just knew she was the goddess who controlled desire, beauty, and the complex emotions that swirl around both. And they wanted her on their side. What we can say with certainty, regardless of which origin story we prefer, is that from the moment of her arrival in the divine realm, everything changed. The very concept of desire, which had existed before in raw, unfocused forms, now had a face, a personality, a will that could be pleased or offended. She would prove to be one of the most powerful, most worshipped, and most troublesome deities in the entire Greek pantheon. And her story, her countless stories, had only just begun. The goddess of beauty and her sacred symbols. To look upon Aphrodite was to forget yourself, to lose track of your purpose, to become suddenly and completely focused on her, to the exclusion of all else. Every description we have from ancient sources struggles with the impossibility of the task. How do you describe perfect beauty in words? How do you capture in language something that by definition transcends language? The poets tried anyway, and their attempts, while inadequate by their own admission, she was golden, they said. A word they used not just for the color of her hair, which might have been blonde or auburn or some shade that has no precise equivalent in our vocabulary, but for a quality of light that seemed to emanate from her very presence, as if she carried her own illumination, as if standing near her was like standing in sunlight even at midnight. She was laughter-loving, a descriptor that suggests not just beauty, but joy, animation, the kind of magnetic personality that makes people want to be close to you, to bask in your attention. She was fair-girdled and well-crowned, references to the jewelry and clothing that enhanced beauty already beyond enhancement. When artists tried to depict her, they aimed for ideal proportions, for the kind of mathematical perfection that the Greeks believed underlaid all beauty. They measured and calculated, trying to capture divine form in marble or bronze or paint. But even the most skilled acknowledged that their work fell short, that no statue could truly capture what Aphrodite must have been like in the imagined flesh. In the earliest representations, she appeared clothed, her body draped in elegant fabric that hinted at the shape beneath, but maintained the modesty that Greek society generally expected from women, even divine ones. But by the 5th century before the Common Era, something changed. Artists began depicting her nude or semi-nude, acknowledging that clothing seemed almost insulting when applied to a body that was itself the definition of beauty. The sculptor Praxiteles created a statue of Aphrodite for the city of Knudos, and it caused a sensation across the Greek world. It was the first full-scale female nude in Greek sculpture, a revolutionary break with tradition. People traveled from across the Mediterranean just to see it. They stood before it in silence or broke into spontaneous praise. Some claimed the marble seemed to breathe, that you could see the warmth of living flesh beneath the cold stone surface. Others told stories about men who fell so deeply in love with the statue that they tried to romance it, leaving offerings, writing poetry, even attempting physical intimacy with the marble in the privacy of night. Whether these stories were true or simply the kind of legend that collects around beautiful things hardly matters. What matters is that they demonstrate the power people attributed to Aphrodite's image. Even a representation, even stone carved to approximate her form, could inspire the kind of obsessive desire that makes rational people behave irrational. But Aphrodite was more than just a beautiful face and form. She came attended by an entire vocabulary of symbols, sacred things that represented different aspects of her nature and power. These symbols weren't arbitrary. Each carried layers of meaning, connections to older deities and older worship practices, threads that led back through the Phoenician goddess Astarte, to the Mesopotamian Ishtar, to the Sumerian Inanna, an ancient chain of goddesses of love and war and fertility, stretching back to the very beginnings of civilization. The dove was perhaps her most constant companion. Doves were sacred to Inanna in Mesopotamia, and when worship of these goddesses traveled west across the Mediterranean, the bird came with them. The ancient Greek word for dove, peristera, may even derive from a Semitic phrase, pera Ishtar, which means bird of Ishtar, though this etymology is debated by scholars. Whatever the linguistic origins, doves were inseparably linked to Aphrodite in Greek art and literature. She appeared with doves perched on her shoulders or cupped gently in her hands. Doves pulled her chariot when she traveled through the air, their wings beating in synchronized rhythm. Her temples were decorated with carved doves, their beaks often holding knotted ribbons or fillets. Worshippers left small votive offerings of white marble doves at her shrines, asking for her blessing in love or simply expressing devotion. The connection between the gentle, amorous bird and the goddess of love seemed natural, almost inevitable. Doves mate for life, or so people believed, and their soft cooing sounds like the murmur of lovers. But Aphrodite also had a relationship with sparrows, those small, promiscuous birds that seemed to represent a different, earthier side of desire. The poet Sappho, writing in the 7th century before the Common Era, described Aphrodite's chariot as drawn by sparrows rather than doves, their quick wings beating furiously as they carried the goddess from her golden house in heaven down to earth to answer a prayer. Sparrows mated frequently, enthusiastically, with many partners, and in ancient minds this made them appropriate servants for the deity who presided over sexual pleasure in all its forms. Swans, too, were sacred to her, though they shared their divine association with other gods. The swan represented a more refined kind of beauty, graceful and stately, moving through water with such elegance that it seemed to glide rather than swim. When depicted with Aphrodite, swans usually appeared in bathing scenes or in images of the goddess attending to her toilette, emphasizing the preparation and presentation of beauty rather than its immediate deployment in seduction. Among flowers and plants, the rose stands supreme as Aphrodite's emblem. So much so that even today we associate roses with romantic love almost automatically. The connection is ancient and deep, woven into multiple myths. In one version, roses sprang from the earth at the moment of Aphrodite's birth, the ground's response to the arrival of beauty itself. In another, roses were originally white, and they turned red when Aphrodite pricked her foot on their thorns while running to help the dying Adonis, her blood staining the petals. In yet another telling, roses grew from the blood that Adonis himself shed when he was killed, Aphrodite's magic transforming his mortality into something that would bloom again each spring. Red roses came to symbolize passionate love, while white roses suggested purity and innocent affection, though both belonged firmly to Aphrodite's domain. Worshippers crowned her statues with rose garlands, threw rose petals during her festivals, offered rose water at her altars. Even today, millennia after her temples fell silent, We'd give roses to express romantic feelings, continuing a tradition so old that its origins have been forgotten by almost everyone who participates in it. Myrtle was another of her sacred plants, though its significance is more obscure to modern readers. One myth tells of a priestess named Myrina, who served Aphrodite faithfully in one of her temples. When Myrina's betrothed, unable to wait for a proper wedding, forcibly removed her from the temple to marry her immediately, Myrina killed him in the struggle that followed, defending her vows and her virtue. Aphrodite, moved by her devotion, and perhaps understanding the violence that love can inspire, transformed Myrina into a myrtle tree, granting her eternal protection. From that time forward, myrtle represented both love and the fierce protective instinct that love can generate. Greek brides wore myrtle wreaths at their weddings, calling on Aphrodite's blessing for their new unions. The apple holds a special, complicated place in Aphrodite's symbolic vocabulary. On one level, apples were simply fruits associated with fertility, abundance, health, and sweetness. They ripened in autumn, providing sustenance, and their blossoms in spring promised plenty to come. But the apple also plays a crucial role in one of Aphrodite's most important myths, the Judgment of Paris, which we'll explore in detail later. The golden apple of discord, inscribed with the words "for the fairest," became both Aphrodite's prize and the catalyst for the Trojan War. After that story, the apple could never be separated from ideas of beauty, competition, desire, and the catastrophic consequences that can follow when vanity and lust combine. In one touching minor myth, Aphrodite transformed a youth named Melos into an apple tree after he killed himself from grief over Adonis's death, showing her capacity for compassion toward those who suffered for love. And in Greek art, Aphrodite often appears holding an apple, offering it, the gesture suggesting both temptation and promised satisfaction of desire. The pomegranate, that strange fruit full of blood-red seeds, was also sacred to her. Some scholars suggest this was because Greek women sometimes used pomegranate seeds as a form of birth control, eating them in hopes of preventing pregnancy, thus linking the fruit to sexual activity without reproduction. Others point to the fruit's appearance when opened, the way the seeds glisten like jewels, or, more provocatively, like the interior of a body, flesh and moisture and fertility made visible. Whatever the reason, pomegranates featured regularly in her worship and iconography. The scallop shell became so closely associated with Aphrodite that it's nearly impossible to see one without thinking of her. This connection goes back to her birth, when she was said to have ridden the waves to Cyprus on a shell, using it as a boat, or perhaps simply materializing within it as she took form. The scallop's shape, a perfect fan with radiating ridges, was aesthetically pleasing in its symmetry and regularity, embodying the kind of mathematical beauty that Greeks valued. But the shell also suggested the feminine form, the womb, the source of life, the hidden place from which new beings emerge. Artists through the ages, most famously Botticelli in his Renaissance painting The Birth of Venus, depicted Aphrodite standing on or emerging from a giant shell, the sea behind her, the shore ahead, caught in that eternal moment of arrival. But perhaps her most famous attribute was neither plant nor animal nor object, but a piece of clothing. The kestos hemos, her magical girdle or breastband, had the power to make anyone who wore it irresistibly desirable. It enhanced beauty, yes, but more than that, it created an aura of attraction that no one could resist. In Homer's Iliad, Hera, queen of the gods and Zeus's wife, borrowed this girdle when she wanted to seduce her husband and distract him from interfering in the Trojan War. The fact that even the queen of the gods needed Aphrodite's help in matters of seduction tells us everything about where real power lay in this domain. The girdle represented Aphrodite's understanding of something the other gods often forgot. Desire is not just about raw physical attraction, but about presentation, mystery, the art of creating allure. Beauty alone might catch the eye, but true seduction, the kind that makes someone unable to think of anything else, requires more. It requires the ability to suggest, to promise, to create anticipation. The magical girdle embodied all of that, distilling Aphrodite's power into a physical object that even other deities coveted. All these symbols, taken together, paint a picture of a goddess whose influence touched nearly every aspect of life that involved attraction, reproduction, and the complex emotions that swirl around both. She was not a simple deity with a simple portfolio. She contained multitudes, the gentle dove and the promiscuous sparrow, the pure white rose and the blood-red one, the refined swan and the earthy apple, the beautiful shell and the practical pomegranate, beauty and danger, pleasure and pain, creation and destruction. This was Aphrodite, and she would prove to be one of the most complex, contradictory, and compelling figures in all of mythology. The marriage that wasn't meant to be. When Aphrodite first appeared among the Olympian gods, her beauty caused an immediate problem. Every unmarried god wanted her. Some of the married gods wanted her too, though they had the decency to be marginally less obvious about it. Arguments erupted almost immediately. Alliances formed and dissolved. Threats were made. Jealousies that had simmered for years suddenly boiled over, with Aphrodite as the excuse, if not the real cause. Zeus, watching this chaos unfold, felt the weight of his position. He was supposed to maintain order among the gods, but how could he when they were fighting over a woman like children fighting over a toy? He'd seen what desire could do, how it could make otherwise rational beings forget themselves entirely. He'd experienced it himself often enough, had fathered countless children with goddesses and nymphs and mortal women, had made his wife Hera perpetually furious with his inability to control himself. The last thing he needed was open warfare among the gods over Aphrodite. The solution he devised was politically clever, but personally cruel. He would marry Aphrodite off to the one god that no one would fight over, the one god that no one envied, the one god whose claim on her would generate no challenges because everyone would understand she could do better. He would give her to Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, the smith god, the one Olympian who was regarded as physically imperfect. Hephaestus was the god of fire and forge, of metalwork and craftsmanship, and all things made by skilled hands. His abilities were beyond compare in all the universe. He could shape metal into anything imaginable, from weapons that never missed their target, to jewelry that seemed to glow with its own inner light. He made the palaces of the gods, each one a masterpiece of architecture and artistry. He forged the armor that Achilles would wear in the Trojan War, armor so magnificent that its description takes up a full section of Homer's Iliad. He created the chains that bound Prometheus to his rock, unbreakable bonds that even a Titan couldn't escape. His workshop, located either on Olympus itself or in the volcanic heart of the island of Lemnos, was a place of constant activity, the ring of hammer on anvil never ceasing, the forge fires burning with a heat that would incinerate a mortal instantly. Hephaestus should have been respected, honored, valued for his unique skills. And in a sense he was. The gods relied on him constantly, always needing something made or repaired or improved. But he was also the only Olympian with a physical disability. He walked with a pronounced limp, supporting himself with a cane, his gait uneven and awkward. The stories differ on how this happened. Some say he was born deformed, and Hera, his mother, was so disgusted by his twisted legs that she threw him from Olympus in shame, hurling her own infant son off a mountain because he didn't meet her standards of divine perfection. He fell for a full day and night before crashing into the sea, where sea nymphs found him and raised him, teaching him the crafts that would become his defining skill. Other versions say he was born perfect, but was thrown from Olympus as an adult during one of the many vicious arguments between his parents, Zeus and Hera. Hephaestus made the mistake of taking his mother's side in the dispute, and Zeus, in a rage, grabbed his son and hurled him off the mountain. The fall crippled him, breaking his legs beyond even divine healing, leaving him permanently lame. Either way, he was marked as different, as lesser, as the one god who didn't quite fit the Olympian ideal of perfect beauty and physical perfection. The ancient sources describe him as kind, patient, and loyal, qualities that should have made him an excellent husband. He wasn't prone to the violent rages that characterized Ares, or the vindictive cruelty that Hera displayed, or the casual indifference that Zeus showed toward the feelings of others. He was steady, reliable, devoted to his work, and, it would turn out, devoted to his wife in a way that her indifference to him all the more painful to witness. When Zeus announced the marriage, Aphrodite accepted, because she had little choice. A father's word, even in a family of gods, carried enormous weight. The expectation was absolute obedience, especially for daughters, even divine ones. Refusing would have been unthinkable. So the wedding took place with all appropriate ceremony. Hephaestus, overjoyed beyond words at the prospect of being married to the most beautiful goddess in existence, barely able to believe his fortune, poured his heart into gifts for his new bride. He made her jewelry that would enhance her already considerable charms, pieces so beautiful that other goddesses grew jealous just seeing them. He fashioned the magical Kestos Hemos, the girdle that made her irresistible, effectively giving Aphrodite an item that increased the power she already possessed beyond measure. He built her a palace next to his workshop, filled with beautiful things, every detail crafted by his own hands, every element designed to please her. She could have anything she wanted, he assured her. Anything at all. He would make the entire world for her if she asked. The problem wasn't that Hephaestus was cruel, or neglectful, or even insufficiently devoted. The problem was simpler and more brutal than that. Aphrodite did not love him. She felt no desire for him. When she looked at her husband bent over his forge, his face smudged with soot, his hands scarred and calloused from his work, his body marked by burns from flying sparks, his walk awkward and painful to watch, she felt nothing, not affection, not attraction, not even pity. Just a vague sense of being trapped in a situation she hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. This wasn't how love was supposed to work. She was the goddess of desire, the one who inspired overwhelming passion in others, who understood the mechanics of attraction better than any being in the universe. And yet her own marriage contained none of what she spent her existence creating for everyone else. The irony wasn't lost on her, and it certainly wasn't lost on the other gods, who watched the mismatch with a mixture of amusement and something that might have been sympathy, if gods were capable of such feelings toward each other. Hephaestus, for his part, seemed to understand that his wife didn't love him, or at least he suspected it. He showered her with gifts, perhaps hoping that if he couldn't inspire love, he could at least buy affection, or gratitude, or some pale imitation of devotion. He never complained when she spent days away from their home. He never questioned her too closely about where she went or whom she saw. He maintained a kind of willful blindness, preferring the illusion of marriage to the reality of acknowledging its emptiness. Whether this was wisdom, or cowardice, or simple self-preservation is difficult to say. The marriage became one of Olympus's worst-kept secrets. Everyone knew it was a failure. Everyone could see that Aphrodite was miserable, that Hephaestus was pathetically grateful for any crumbs of attention, that the whole arrangement satisfied no one except Zeus, who had successfully neutralized a potential source of conflict by creating an entirely different misery. But Hephaestus couldn't ignore it forever. The truth was too obvious, too public, too humiliating. Aphrodite wasn't just unhappy in her marriage. She was having an affair. And not with some obscure minor deity that Hephaestus might pretend not to notice. She was sleeping with Ares, the god of war, one of the most prominent and proudest of the Olympians, one of the most visible gods in the entire pantheon. And soon everyone would know about it in the most embarrassing way possible. The affair that shook Olympus. Ares was everything Hephaestus was not. Tall where Hephaestus was average height. Strong and straight-backed where Hephaestus limped. Handsome in an aggressive, dangerous way that made hearts race and palms sweat. He was the god of war, but not the kind of strategic, planned warfare that Athena embodied. Ares represented battle lust, the chaos of combat, the red rage that transforms civilized men into beasts who kill without thought or mercy. He loved fighting for its own sake, loved the sound of clashing weapons and screaming warriors, and men calling out their last words before death took them. The smell of blood excited him. The sight of carnage pleased him. In Homer's Iliad, Zeus calls him the most hateful of all the gods who hold Olympus. The other gods largely disliked or distrusted Ares. He was too unpredictable, too violent, too willing to escalate any conflict into bloodshed. But Aphrodite saw something different when she looked at him. Perhaps it was precisely the contrast with her husband that made Ares appealing. Hephaestus was careful, patient, methodical, a craftsman who measured twice and cut once, who thought through every action before taking it. Ares was pure impulse and instinct, a being who acted without thinking, who followed his desires wherever they led, without calculation or hesitation. Where Hephaestus built things, Ares destroyed them. Where Hephaestus was gentle, Ares was rough. Where Hephaestus asked permission, Ares simply took. The attraction between the goddess of love and the god of war became one of the great paradoxes of Greek mythology, and yet it makes a certain psychological sense. Both dealt in passion, in the overwhelming of rational thought, in the kind of intensity that changes everything it touches. Love and war were both forces that made people forget themselves, abandon their usual constraints, do things they never imagined they were capable of. The connection between them was deeper than it first appeared. No one knows exactly when the affair began. It had probably been going on for some time, conducted in secrecy, with both of them being careful to maintain discretion. Aphrodite and Ares would meet when Hephaestus was absorbed in his work, when he was likely to notice her absence. They stole moments together in hidden places, far from the eyes of other gods. They were, for a while, successfully secretive. But discretion has limits, especially for beings with eternity ahead of them. They grew bolder, more careless. Ares started spending more time on Olympus, finding excuses to be near Aphrodite's palace. Their glances lingered too long at public gatherings. Their absences began to coincide in ways that seemed less and less coincidental. People noticed, gods gossiped, and eventually word reached someone who wouldn't keep the secret. Helios saw them. Helios, the Titan god of the sun, whose chariot rides across the sky each day, who sees everything that happens beneath his light, who misses nothing that occurs in the daylight hours. He saw Aphrodite and Ares together in a way that left absolutely no doubt about the nature of their relationship. And Helios, whether motivated by a sense of justice, or simple enjoyment of drama, or perhaps some grudge against Aphrodite that the myths don't record, went directly to Hephaestus and told him the truth. Hephaestus listened to Helios's report in silence. When the sun god finished and departed, the lame craftsman remained in his workshop, staring into the forge fire, his mind racing. He felt, perhaps for the first time, the full, crushing weight of humiliation. It was one thing to suspect, to have vague, uncomfortable feelings about his wife's fidelity. It was entirely different to know for certain, to have it confirmed by a reliable witness, to understand that his suspicions hadn't been paranoia, but accurate assessment all along. And the knowledge that others knew, that the affair was so obvious that even Helios had felt compelled to report it, made everything infinitely worse. But Hephaestus was not a god of rage or impulsive violence. He didn't storm out to confront his wife or challenge Ares to combat. He was a god of craft, of planning, of creating solutions to problems. And he already had an idea forming, a plan that would expose the lovers and force them to feel even a fraction of the humiliation he felt. He turned to his forge and began to work. What he created over the next hours was a net unlike any that had ever existed. The links were made from metal so fine they were nearly invisible, as delicate as spider silk, but utterly unbreakable. He worked the metal with all his skill, infusing it with properties that would respond to his will, making it tighten or release on his command. When he was finished, he had a trap that no god could escape, camouflaged so perfectly that even divine eyes wouldn't see it until it was too late. He took the net home and spent an afternoon carefully arranging it around his marriage bed. He attached it to the bedposts, draped invisible loops from the ceiling beams, set it up so that the slightest weight in precisely the right place would trigger the mechanism and bring the whole thing crashing down. Then he announced to Aphrodite that he was leaving for a trip to Lemnos, his favorite place on Earth, where he sometimes went to work on special projects. He gathered some supplies, made a show of preparation, and departed, walking slowly away on his bad leg, his cane tapping rhythmically against stone. Ares had been watching. Ares was always watching for opportunities, always alert for moments when Hephaestus's attention was elsewhere. As soon as the craftsman disappeared over the horizon, the war god made his way to the smith's house, his heart already pounding with anticipation. Aphrodite met him at the door, smiling, relieved to finally have privacy, to not have to worry about being seen or discovered. She took his hand and led him inside, through halls decorated with her husband's metalwork, beautiful pieces that neither of them noticed or cared about in that moment. They went to the bedroom where Hephaestus and Aphrodite supposedly slept together, though how often Aphrodite actually shared that bed with her husband is unclear. "Come," Aphrodite said, pulling Ares toward the bed. "Let's go to bed and make love together. Hephaestus is not home. No doubt he's gone to visit Lemnos and the Sintians, those men who speak like barbarians." Ares needed no further encouragement. They fell into the bed together, wrapped in each other, lost in desire, completely unaware that above them and around them, invisible metal waited for precisely this moment. The instant their combined weight settled on the bed, the trap sprang. The net fell like a shroud, dropping over them, wrapping around their bodies, pulling tight. They tried to move and couldn't, tried to sit up, and found themselves pressed back down. The more they struggled, the more entangled they became. And with growing horror, they realized that they couldn't even transform themselves, couldn't shift into animals or mist or any of the other shapes gods routinely used to escape difficult situations. The net held their divine forms as securely as it held their physical bodies. Ares began to curse. his voice rising in anger and fear. Aphrodite went very still, a terrible understanding dawning in her eyes. This wasn't an accident. This was a trap, carefully planned and perfectly executed, which meant that Hephaestus knew about them, had known for long enough to prepare this, and is probably close by. And then they heard footsteps approaching, heavy, uneven footsteps, the distinctive gait of someone walking with a cane. Hephaestus appeared in the doorway of his bedroom, and stood there, looking at his wife and her lover, trapped in his bed, caught in the act, literally tangled together in his unbreakable net. For a moment he said nothing, just stared, letting them feel his presence, letting their humiliation begin to settle in. Then he raised his voice, projecting it across Olympus with a volume and clarity that gods use when they want to ensure everyone hears. Father Zeus, and you other sacred gods who live forever, come here, so you can see something disgusting and ridiculous. Aphrodite, Zeus's daughter, scorns me because I was born weak and ugly. She lusts after Ares, the destroyer, because he is handsome and strong-legged, while I limp. But if anyone is to blame for my condition, it's my parents for bringing me into the world this way. But come and see where these two are sleeping together, in my own bed. The sight causes me pain, but everyone should witness this. The gods came. Not the goddesses, interestingly. Not Hera, not Demeter, not Athena. The female deities held themselves apart, as if participating in the viewing would be beneath their dignity, or perhaps out of solidarity with Aphrodite, or simply because they found the whole spectacle distasteful. But the male gods arrived eagerly, almost running to see what Hephaestus had caught. Apollo came, and Poseidon, and Hermes. They crowded into the doorway and stared at the sight before them, the goddess of love and the god of war, naked, trapped, helpless, exposed in the most humiliating way possible. And they laughed. Uncontrollable laughter filled the room as the gods beheld the spectacle, pointing and making comments, and generally treating the whole thing as the best entertainment they'd had in years. It was funny, in a cruel way. The mighty Ares, who thought himself invincible, caught like a rabbit in a snare. The beautiful Aphrodite, who could make any man do her bidding with a smile, reduced to squirming in shame under the gaze of her peers. Even in mythology, there's schadenfreude, that dark human pleasure at seeing the powerful brought low. Among the laughter, one god made a comment that would be repeated for centuries afterward. Hermes, known for his wit and his own appreciation of physical pleasure, leaned over to Apollo and asked quietly, but not quietly enough, "Apollo, Would you be willing to be bound in such strong chains if it meant you could lie with golden Aphrodite? Apollo barely hesitated before answering. Hermes, I would gladly accept bonds 3 times as strong, and let all you gods look on, if it meant I could share a bed with Aphrodite. More laughter erupted at this answer. The message was clear. Even trapped and humiliated, even caught in the most embarrassing situation possible, Aphrodite was still so desirable that gods would volunteer for the same punishment just for the chance to be with her. The compliment, if it can be called that, probably didn't make Aphrodite feel any better about her situation. Poseidon, however, seemed less amused than the others. He approached Hephaestus and spoke seriously, his voice low. Release them. I give you my word that Eris will pay whatever penalty you demand, anything that's right and proper before the immortal gods. Let them go. Hephaestus considered this. The anger that had driven him to create the trap was fading now, replaced by a cold kind of satisfaction. He had made his point. Everyone had seen. The humiliation was complete. Keeping them trapped longer wouldn't increase his revenge, would just make the whole situation more awkward. He nodded slowly, and, with a gesture, released the net. The metal loosened and fell away. The moment the bonds freed them, both Aphrodite and Eris leapt from the bed. Eris immediately fled to his homeland of Thrace, that wild northern region he loved, needing to put distance between himself and Olympus, between himself and the laughter that still echoed in his ears. Aphrodite vanished to Paphos in Cyprus, to her sacred precinct there, to the temple where she was worshipped and where she could hide and recover from the shame. At Paphos, the Graces, those divine attendants who represented charm and beauty, bathed her and anointed her with oil, the kind of fragrant oil that only gods use, that gleams on immortal skin. They took gorgeous clothes and dressed her carefully, restoring her dignity piece by piece, helping her become herself again after the degradation. But the memory of that humiliation would never entirely fade. The story of Eris and Aphrodite caught in Hephaestus's net became one of the most famous tales in all of Greek mythology, retold by poets, depicted by artists, analyzed by philosophers for what it said about desire, jealousy, marriage, and revenge. It appeared in Homer's Odyssey, in Ovid's poetry, in countless vase paintings and relief sculptures. It became the archetypal story of the unfaithful wife and the cuckold husband who gets his revenge through cleverness rather than violence. But the affair didn't end with the exposure. Despite everything, despite the humiliation before the assembled gods, the powerful attraction between Aphrodite continued to draw them back together. They couldn't stay apart. Whatever force pulled them toward each other was stronger than shame, stronger than social expectations, stronger than anything that should have made them reconsider. They resumed their relationship, more discreetly this time, but it continued. And from their union came children, several of them, each representing different aspects of what love and war combine. There was Harmony, goddess of harmony and concord, showing that sometimes the combination of opposites creates balance rather than chaos. She would grow up to marry Cadmus, founder of Thebes, and her own story would be marked by blessing and curse. But that's another tale. They also bore twin sons named Phobos and Deimos, whose names mean fear and terror, respectively. These two became their father's constant companions, riding with him into battle, driving his war chariot, spreading panic among his enemies on the battlefield. Where Eris went, Phobos and Deimos followed, and men fled before them, hearts pounding, minds blank with terror. They were the physical manifestation of what happens when the protective, possessive side of love turns aggressive, when passion becomes violence. Some sources name Eros, the god of desire, as a child of Aphrodite and Eris, though other myths make Eros primordial, existing from the beginning of creation. If he was their son, it creates an interesting symmetry. Eros was the god of the arrows that pierce the heart and make rational thought impossible, the force that makes people forget themselves in pursuit of another. He inherited his mother's beauty and her power over desire, and his father's aggressive pursuit of what he wanted. The relationship between Aphrodite and Eris became an accepted fact of Olympian life. Hephaestus never divorced Aphrodite. She remained his wife, at least officially, at least in name. But everyone understood the reality, and Hephaestus, having made his point with the golden net, seemed to accept it with the weary resignation of someone who has tried to change what cannot be changed, and has finally given up. The affair became a symbol for something the Greeks understood, that desire doesn't follow rules, that love can flourish in unexpected combinations, that sometimes the heart wants what it wants, regardless of consequence or propriety or social expectations. Aphrodite and Eris together represented the dangerous allure of forbidden passion, the thrill of breaking rules, the way desire can make fools of even the wisest, the mightiest, the most beautiful. But Eris was not Aphrodite's only love, not by far. The goddess of desire would have many affairs, with gods and with mortals, each leaving its mark on the mythology that tried to contain her story. And of all those loves, none would touch her more deeply or end more tragically than her relationship with a mortal youth named Adonis. The tragedy of Adonis. Of all Aphrodite's loves, none touched her more deeply or ended more tragically than her relationship with a mortal youth named Adonis. This story contains everything that makes Greek mythology so compelling and so painful: impossible beauty, divine jealousy, a love that crosses the boundary between immortal and mortal, and a death that feels both inevitable and cruelly unfair. It's a story that the Greeks told to explain the changing seasons, to understand the cycles of life and death in nature. But underneath all that symbolic meaning lies something simpler and more raw: grief. Adonis's birth itself was strange and troubling, marked by divine interference and human transgression. His mother was Myrrha, also called Smyrna, a princess of Cyprus. His father was king of that island, but Myrrha was also Cinyarus's daughter, making Adonis the product of incest, born from a union that violated one of humanity's most fundamental taboos. And Aphrodite herself engineered this terrible situation, though the reasons differ depending on which version of the story you follow. In some tellings, Myra's mother had committed the sin of hubris, boasting that her daughter was more beautiful than Aphrodite herself. The goddess, hearing this claim, decided to punish the insult by cursing Myra with an overwhelming, irresistible lust for her own father. In other versions, Myra had simply neglected Aphrodite's worship, had failed to honor the goddess properly, and this was her punishment for that neglect. Either way, Aphrodite planted in the young woman's heart a desire she knew was wrong, but couldn't control, couldn't resist, couldn't reason away. Myra found herself consumed by thoughts of her father that no daughter should have. She tried to fight them, tried to focus on anything else, tried to be a good daughter who felt appropriate feelings. But the curse was too strong. The desire grew until it eclipsed everything else in her mind. With the help of her nurse, an older woman who took pity on Myra's suffering, even if she couldn't approve of its cause, she began sneaking into her father's bedchamber at night. Under cover of darkness, disguised so Cinyarus wouldn't recognize her, Myra slept with her own father night after night. Cinyarus, never suspecting the woman in his bed was his daughter, accepted what seemed like a series of pleasant encounters with a mysterious lover. The deception continued for months, and, inevitably, Myra became pregnant. Eventually, Cinyarus discovered the truth. The details vary, but in most versions he caught a glimpse of her face in lamplight one night, or grew suspicious and set a trap, or simply recognized something familiar in her voice or touch. When he realized he had been sleeping with his own daughter, his rage was terrible and immediate. He grabbed his sword and chased Myra through the palace, through the gardens, out into the countryside beyond, intent on killing her for what she had done, for what they had done together. Myra ran until she could run no more. Her legs gave out, her breath failed, her body simply couldn't continue. In her desperation, knowing her father would catch her within moments, she prayed to the gods for mercy, for help, for anything that would save her from his blade. The gods heard her prayer and, in their own strange way, answered it. They transformed her into a tree. Her legs became roots sinking into the earth. Her arms became branches reaching toward the sky. Her skin hardened into bark. Her tears became the fragrant resin that would give the myrrh tree its name and its value. She was safe from her father's sword, but trapped in wood and bark, neither fully alive nor truly dead, frozen in a state between human and plant. But she was still pregnant. For 10 months the myrrh tree grew heavy with its impossible burden, swelling with the child growing inside. Finally, the time came for birth. Some versions say a wild boar used its tusks to tear open the bark, acting either on instinct or divine prompting. Others say Cinulus, who had tracked his daughter to this spot and somehow knew what had happened, shot an arrow into the tree, splitting it open. Either way, the bark cracked and split, and from within the tree emerged a baby boy. He was perfect, small and vulnerable as all newborns are, wailing with healthy lungs, but already there was something in his face that suggested he would grow into extraordinary beauty. The infant had inherited his mother's beauty, and through her, perhaps some echo of the divine power that had cursed her in the first place. Aphrodite, who had been watching this entire sequence of events that she herself had set in motion, took one look at the baby and felt something shift inside her divine heart. This was more than aesthetic appreciation of a beautiful child, though the baby was undeniably beautiful even in infancy. There was something about him, some quality that touched even a goddess, that made her feel protective and possessive in ways she hadn't anticipated. She gathered the infant up, this child born of incest and curse and transformation, and decided to protect him. But she couldn't raise him herself. Goddesses don't typically involve themselves in the day-to-day care of mortal infants, all those feedings and changings and constant attention that babies require. So she placed baby Adonis in an ornate chest, a beautiful container worthy of precious cargo, and took him to Persephone, queen of the underworld, asking her to watch over the child for a while. Persephone agreed, perhaps curious about what Aphrodite found so compelling about this particular mortal baby. When she opened the chest and saw Adonis for the first time, she understood immediately. Even as an infant, his beauty was remarkable, unusual, something that made you want to keep looking, to keep holding him close. And as he grew in the shadowy halls of Hades, raised by the queen of the dead among ghosts and shades, he became more beautiful still. By the time he reached adolescence, he was the most handsome youth either goddess had ever seen. Perfect features, proportioned in ways that seemed to embody ideal beauty. A body that moved with unconscious grace, athletic and strong, but not overly muscled. Eyes that held both innocence and something deeper, something that suggested old wisdom in a young face. His beauty wasn't just physical, but had a quality of presence, of being, that made people want to be near him, to serve him, to please him. Persephone found herself increasingly drawn to her charge. She spent more time with him, delighting in her company, teaching him about the realm of the dead, watching him grow from child to youth. When Aphrodite finally returned to collect Adonis, intending to bring him back to the world of light and warmth, Persephone refused to give him back. A dispute erupted, quickly escalating from disagreement to argument to divine conflict. Both goddesses wanted Adonis. Both believed they had a rightful claim on him, and neither was willing to compromise or step aside. The argument grew so heated that Zeus himself had to intervene. The king of the gods, probably weary of the conflict, and perhaps secretly amused by two powerful goddesses fighting over a mortal youth, made a ruling that he likely thought was fair and balanced. Adonis would divide his year into 3 equal parts. 1/3 he would spend with Aphrodite, 1/3 with Persephone, and 1/3 alone, free to choose his own company and follow his own desires. It was the kind of bureaucratic solution that looks reasonable when written down, but completely ignores the emotional reality underneath. You can't divide love into neat thirds and expect everyone to be satisfied. But Zeus had spoken, and his word was law, so the arrangement became official. Adonis, given the choice for his free third of the year, chose to spend it with Aphrodite. Whether this was because he genuinely preferred her company, or because the world of light was more pleasant than the realm of the dead, or simply because she was the more familiar presence from his earliest memories, we don't know. What we do know is that for 8 months of every year, Aphrodite and Adonis were together. And for those months, the goddess of love was happier than she had ever been, more content than in all her centuries of existence. She was utterly devoted to him in a way that shocked the other gods who knew her. Aphrodite, who had inspired countless obsessive loves, who had watched mortals and immortals make fools of themselves pursuing desire, now found herself in the grip of the very force she embodied. She stopped visiting Olympus. She neglected her duties. She let her appearance go, wearing simple clothing instead of her elaborate finery, letting her hair tangle with leaves and twigs, going barefoot through the wilderness. She didn't care. All that mattered was being with Adonis. She followed him on his hunts, though she had never been a hunting goddess, had never shown interest in the chase before. She cheered when his dogs flushed rabbits from the underbrush and deer from the trees. She admired his skill with a spear, the way he could throw and hit a moving target, the patience he showed in tracking. But she also worried constantly. Adonis was mortal, fragile in ways that gods never are. Every hunt carried risk. Every moment in the forest could be his last. She began warning him repeatedly, almost obsessively, to be careful, to avoid dangerous prey, to remember that some beasts could kill even the strongest hunter. "Dear boy," she would say, taking his face in her hands, making him look at her, "do not be rash. Do not attack the wild beasts which are armed by nature, lest your glory may cost me great sorrow. Neither youth, nor beauty, nor the deeds which have moved me to love you have any effect on lions or bristling boars. Be careful of their eyes and tempers. Boars have the force of lightning in their curved tusks, and the rage of tawny lions knows no limits. I hate and fear that breed. Dear boy." Adonis would smile at her warnings, kiss her gently, promise to be careful. He meant it when he said it, but he was young, and youth has its own kind of invincibility, a certainty that bad things happen to other people, never to yourself. He had hunted his whole life and never been seriously injured. Why would that change now? Her warnings seemed like overprotectiveness, like someone who didn't understand hunting trying to impose unnecessary caution on someone who knew what he was doing. One day, Aphrodite had to leave. Divine business called her away, something she couldn't ignore no matter how much she wanted to stay. She extracted one more promise from Adonis to be safe, to avoid dangerous animals, to remember that she needed him to come back to her whole and alive. Then she reluctantly departed, looking back multiple times as she left, her heart heavy with an anxiety she couldn't quite explain. Adonis, finding himself alone and the day still young, decided to go hunting. His dogs picked up a scent almost immediately, the trail of a wild boar. It was a huge creature, battle-scarred and mean, the kind of animal that smart hunters avoid. A wiser man might have let it go, might have chosen easier prey, might have remembered his beloved's warnings. But Adonis was confident in his skills. He tracked the boar to its lair, waiting patiently for the right moment. When it burst from the undergrowth, massive and fast, he was ready. His spear flew straight and true, piercing the beast's hide, sinking deep into muscle. But the wound wasn't deep enough to kill. The boar, now in terrible pain and enraged beyond reason, turned and charged. Adonis tried to dodge, but wasn't quite fast enough. The boar's tusk caught him in the groin, tearing through flesh, severing the femoral artery. He fell hard, blood pumping from the wound in rhythmic spurts, staining the yellow sand beneath him dark red. His dogs howled and fled. The boar, either satisfied or perhaps dying itself from the spear wound, staggered away into the undergrowth. And Adonis lay there alone, one hand pressed uselessly to the wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, knowing he was dying, calling out for help that wouldn't come in time. Aphrodite, wherever she was in that moment, felt it. The bond between them was strong enough that his death reached her across whatever distance separated them. A sudden tearing sensation in her chest, a knowledge that something had gone terribly wrong. She turned and raced back, flying through the air faster than she had ever moved, desperate, terrified, praying to whatever powers might listen, that she was wrong, that she had misunderstood what she felt. But when she reached the place, she found her dying. Still alive, barely, but fading fast. The sand around him was soaked with blood. His face had gone pale. His breathing was shallow and rapid. She gathered him into her arms, his blood soaking her dress, and began to weep. Great, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body, tears that fell on his face like rain. He opened his eyes and saw her, managed a weak smile, tried to say something, but couldn't make the words come. She held him tighter, whispering frantically, promising she would make him immortal, swearing she would find a way to save him, offering anything if he would just stay, just hold on a little longer. But the power to reverse death belonged to other gods, not to her. All her beauty, all her divine status, all the love in her heart couldn't save a mortal from the simple, brutal fact of a fatal wound. He died in her arms. His eyes went dim. His breathing stopped. His body went limp with that particular heaviness that only death brings. Aphrodite sat there holding him, keening her grief. A sound so terrible that it was said even the gods on Olympus heard it and shuddered. After a long time, when the first shock of grief had passed into something more like numbness, Aphrodite did what the gods so often do when faced with loss they can't process in any healthy way. She transformed him. Where his blood had fallen, she caused red anemones to spring up, those delicate windflowers that bloom briefly and brilliantly, and then scatter in the slightest breeze, as if even nature mourns their passing. In some versions, she pricked her own foot on the thorns of white roses while running to help him, and her blood turned the roses red, linking her pain forever to his death. She also instituted a festival in his honor, the Adonia, celebrated annually by women across the Greek world, and later the Roman world. They would plant gardens of Adonis in shallow baskets or broken pots, quick-growing seeds like lettuce or fennel, that would sprout rapidly and die just as fast, representing his brief, beautiful life. They would place these gardens on rooftops or in windows where the sun would beat down on them, hastening their growth and their inevitable withering. And when the plants died, the women would mourn publicly, crying out their grief in the streets, tearing their clothes, beating their breasts, expressing a sorrow that was about more than just one dead youth. It was about all beautiful things that die too soon, all loves that end before they should, all the ways that life disappoints us by being temporary. The story became one of the great tragic loves of Greek mythology, retold by poets, depicted by artists, analyzed for what it said about desire and mortality, and the ways that divine beings are not so different from mortals when it comes to pain. Aphrodite, who had made so many others suffer for love, now understood that suffering herself. She carried that grief with her for the rest of her existence, a scar that even eternity couldn't fully heal. The Shepherd Prince and the founding of Rome. But Adonis was not Aphrodite's only mortal lover, and his story, tragic as it was, did not have the far-reaching historical consequences of another of her earthly romances. Before Adonis, there was Anchises, a prince of Troy, and from their union would come a chain of events that would culminate in the founding of the greatest empire the ancient world would ever see. Anchises was from a lesser branch of the royal family of Troy, related to King Priam, but not important enough to be involved in court politics or diplomatic missions. Instead, he lived on the slopes of Mount Ida, that forested mountain overlooking Troy. By all accounts, he was extraordinarily handsome in the way mortal men can be handsome. Not the impossible perfection of gods, but a real, breathing vitality, a physicality that came from outdoor work and good health, an unconscious grace in how he moved through the world. Zeus, watching Aphrodite's activities with growing irritation, decided she needed a lesson in humility. She had been making the other gods fall in love with mortals for years, probably centuries, embarrassing them, causing them to act in ways beneath their dignity. Zeus himself had fathered countless half-mortal children because of desires that Aphrodite had kindled in his heart. He had made a fool of himself, pursuing women in the shapes of bulls and swans and showers of gold. Now he decided it was Aphrodite's turn to experience the same kind of overwhelming, inappropriate, humiliating desire. He whispered her name into the wind with just enough divine power behind it to accomplish what he intended. And Aphrodite, hearing it, felt desire bloom in her heart for a mortal she had never met. It was a strange sensation for her, being on the receiving end of this power she usually wielded. The obsessive thinking, the inability to focus on anything else, the overwhelming need to see this person, to be near them, to touch them. She tried to resist at first, knowing what Zeus had done, understanding that this was manipulation, a divine trap. But resistance only made the longing worse, made the need more intense. Finally, she gave in and went looking for Anchises. She found him on Mount Ida in the late afternoon, the golden light of the setting sun making everything glow. He was tending his cattle, checking them over, making sure none had wandered off or gotten injured. When she saw him, the desire that Zeus had planted in her heart became something genuine, something that transcended the artificial origin. He was beautiful in a way that appealed to her, moved with a grace that made her want to watch him, had a quality of presence that drew her attention and held it. She didn't reveal her true nature. Gods rarely do when approaching mortals they want to seduce. The gulf between divine and human is too vast, the power differential too extreme. Instead, she disguised herself as a mortal princess, dressed in clothing that was fine but believable, adorned with jewelry that was beautiful but not impossibly so. She made herself look like someone a shepherd prince might conceivably meet, someone whose presence on a mountainside might be unusual but not impossible. When she approached him, she had her story ready. She told Anchises that she had been kidnapped from her homeland by Hermes, the messenger god, who had carried her through the air to this mountain. But Hermes had promised her, she said, that she was destined to be Anchises' bride, that their marriage had been ordained by fate itself. It was a clever lie, explaining her sudden appearance while also flattering the young shepherd by suggesting that the gods themselves had chosen him for her. Anchises, seeing this beautiful woman claiming to be fated to marry him, needed very little convincing. She was lovely. She said she was meant to be his, and he was young and healthy, and presumably had normal desires. They went to his hut, a simple structure that was his home during the months he spent with the herds on the mountain. There, on a bed covered with the furs of bears and lions that Anchises himself had killed, they made love. For Aphrodite, it was a different experience than her encounters with gods. Mortals were softer, warmer, more vulnerable. Their bodies had limits, got tired, needed rest. There was a sweetness to it, an intimacy that felt different from divine couplings. And for the first time in her long existence, she felt something beyond just physical pleasure. She felt connection, genuine emotion, something that might almost be called love, if gods can feel such things towards mortals. Afterward, as Anchises slept beside her, exhausted and satisfied, Aphrodite lay awake, thinking about the complications this would cause. She was pregnant already, she could tell, divine senses making such things immediately obvious. The child would be half mortal, half divine, neither fully one nor the other, caught between worlds. And she would have to tell Anchises the truth about who she really was. She woke him gently. He opened his eyes, smiled at her, reached to pull her close again. But then she revealed her true form, letting the mortal disguise fall away, and suddenly he was looking at a goddess, radiant, terrible, overwhelming in her beauty and power. Anchises recoiled in terror. Mortals who saw gods in their true forms often died from the experience, either struck dead by the divine radiance or driven mad by what their human minds couldn't process. To have slept with a goddess, even unknowingly, felt like a transgression that could carry a death sentence. But Aphrodite calmed him, speaking gently, assuring him that she meant him no harm. She told him about the child growing inside her, a son who would be named Aeneas. She prophesied that the boy would be raised by mountain nymphs for his first 5 years, protected and educated in the wilderness, and then would come to Troy to take his place among the nobility as Anchices's acknowledged son. The child would be great, she promised, a hero, someone his father could be proud of, someone whose name would be remembered long after both of them were gone. Then she gave him a warning, and her voice became deadly serious. He must never tell anyone that he had slept with Aphrodite. The other gods, particularly Zeus, must never know the truth. If Anchises revealed what had happened, if he boasted about his conquest of a goddess, if he let pride override discretion, Zeus would kill him with a thunderbolt. It wouldn't be a quick death. Thunderbolts didn't just kill, they destroyed, left bodies charred and unrecognizable. His life depended absolutely on his silence. Anchises promised, swearing every oath he could think of, calling upon every god he could name to witness his vow. He understood the danger. He would keep the secret. He swore it on his life, on his honor, on his future son. Aphrodite wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. She took his promises at face value, kissed him farewell, and departed, leaving him alone on the mountain with memories that would haunt him forever. The child Aeneas was born and raised exactly as Aphrodite had predicted. The nymphs of Mount Ida, divine spirits of the wilderness, cared for him in his early years. They taught him to walk and speak, kept him safe from the predators that roamed the mountain, gave him the kind of education that comes from living close to nature. When he turned 5, they brought him to Anchises, who recognized his son immediately in the child's face and bearing. Aeneas grew up in Troy, trained in combat as befitted a prince, learned the arts of war and leadership, married, fathered children of his own. His life seemed blessed by fortune in ways that suggested divine protection still watched over him. But Anchises couldn't keep the secret. Maybe it was pride, that fundamental human weakness that so often brings down tragic heroes. Maybe it was wine, loosening his tongue at some feast or celebration. Maybe it was simply the human need to share extraordinary experiences, the difficulty of keeping something so significant locked inside. At some gathering, among friends or family, someone asked about Aeneas's mother, about the circumstances of her birth. And Anchises, forgetting his promise, or perhaps deciding that enough time had passed that it didn't matter, told them. Not just any woman, he said with poorly concealed pride, but Aphrodite herself. The goddess of love had desired him so much that she came to him disguised as a mortal princess. Their son was half divine, touched by divinity, marked for greatness. The words reached Zeus almost immediately. Whether someone reported them directly, or whether the king of the gods heard them through whatever omniscient senses he possessed, doesn't matter. What matters is that Zeus knew, and his response was swift and terrible. A thunderbolt fell from a clear sky, a searing bolt of divine lightning that struck Anchises where he stood. It didn't kill him. Aphrodite, still watching over her former lover through the years and distance, managed to intervene. She threw her magical girdle between Anchises and the lightning, deflecting the worst of the strike. But she couldn't completely protect him. The lightning still hit, and Anchises survived, but he was transformed by it. From that day forward, he walked with a terrible limp, worse even than Hephaestus's disability. His legs were twisted and weak, barely able to support his weight. Some sources say he was also blinded, his eyes seared by the flash. The handsome shepherd prince who had once attracted a goddess was now a cripple, dependent on others for the simplest tasks, unable to walk more than a few steps with pain. It was a harsh punishment, a permanent physical reminder of the price of pride. But Zeus's point was made. Mortals who consorted with gods pay a price, and the price was always steep, always permanent. Anchises lived for many more years, long enough to see his city Troy besieged by the Greek army, long enough to witness the destruction of everything his civilization had built, long enough to be carried on his son's back from the burning ruins. That image of Aeneas bearing his crippled father through the flames while leading his young son by the hand became one of the most famous in all of classical art. It symbolized filial devotion, the duty children owe to parents who have suffered, the continuation of family even in the midst of apocalypse. Roman artists returned to it again and again, painting it, sculpting it, citing it as the foundational myth of their own values. Because the real consequences of Aphrodite's affair with Anchises wouldn't become clear for generations. Aeneas survived the fall of Troy, and, after years of wandering, arrived in Italy. There he married a local princess, founded a settlement, and became the ancestor of the Roman people. His descendants included Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome itself. Through Aeneas, Aphrodite became the divine ancestress of the entire Roman nation. The Romans took this connection extremely seriously. They renamed Aphrodite Venus and elevated her to a position of extraordinary importance in their religion and political mythology. Julius Caesar claimed direct descent from Venus through Aeneas's son, Aeolus, and built temples to Venus Genetrix, Venus the Mother, celebrating her as the source of his family's divine right to rule. Later emperors followed his lead, all claiming Venus as their ancestor, all using her name and her story to legitimize their power and authority. In a very real sense, that brief affair on Mount Ida between a goddess and a shepherd prince changed the course of Western civilization. Without Aeneas, there would have been no Rome. Without Rome, no empire, that spread across the Mediterranean, no roads and aqueducts and cities that became the foundation of European civilization, no legal systems and concepts of citizenship that still influence us today. The consequences of that one night of divine desire echoed through millennia, shaping the world we inherited. The golden apple and the war that followed. But of all Aphrodite's actions, none had more catastrophic consequences than what began as a simple beauty contest. This is the story of the Judgment of Paris, and it started with a wedding invitation that went very, very wrong. The sea goddess Thetis was marrying a mortal named Peleus. It was an unusual match, goddess and human, but Zeus had arranged it for his own complicated reasons involving prophecies and potential threats to his power. The wedding was to be a grand affair, and all the gods were invited to attend and celebrate. All except one. Eris, the goddess of discord and strife, was deliberately excluded from the guest list. The other gods, perhaps understandably, didn't want chaos and conflict disrupting what was supposed to be a joyous celebration. They hoped she simply wouldn't notice the snub, or wouldn't care enough to make an issue of it. They were wrong. Eris appeared at the wedding anyway, not to join the feast, but to cause exactly the kind of trouble the gods had hoped to avoid. She brought a gift, a single golden apple, perfect in every detail, inscribed with 3 words that seemed innocent, but were designed to create maximum discord. She rolled this apple into the middle of the celebration, where all the gods could see it, and then vanished. Her work done, satisfied that she had planted a seed of conflict that would grow into something far larger than anyone anticipated. 3 goddesses immediately reached for the apple. Hera, queen of the gods, whose pride would not allow anyone else to claim superior beauty. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, who, in addition to her famous intelligence, was considered exceptionally beautiful by divine standards. And Aphrodite, whose entire portfolio was beauty and desire, and who could not possibly concede that anyone was fairer than herself. Each goddess insisted the apple was clearly meant for her. Arguments erupted immediately. The wedding feast ground to an uncomfortable halt as 3 of the most powerful beings in existence bickered about which of them deserved the golden apple most. The other gods watched nervously, knowing that whatever happened next would not be pleasant for anyone. Zeus knew he had to intervene. As king of the gods, maintaining order was his responsibility. But he also knew that he absolutely could not be the one to choose. Whichever goddess he picked, the other 2 would be furious with him, would see his choice as favoritism or insult or politically motivated. His life was already complicated enough by Hera's constant jealousy over his affairs. He couldn't risk making that situation worse. He needed someone else to judge the contest, someone who couldn't refuse the task, someone mortal who would bear the consequences instead of him. His choice fell on a young man living as a shepherd on Mount Ida, the same mountain where Aphrodite had seduced Anchises years before. His name was Paris, also called Alexander, And he was actually a prince of Troy, though he didn't know it yet. His mother Hecuba had dreamed before his birth that she would give birth to a flaming torch that would burn down the entire city. King Priam, Paris's father, had ordered the infant exposed on the mountain to die, hoping to avert the prophecy. But shepherds had found the baby and raised him as one of their own. So Paris grew to manhood, living simply, tending flocks, unaware of his royal heritage. Hermes, Zeus's messenger, brought the three goddesses to where Paris was keeping watch over his cattle. He explained the situation. Here were three goddesses, here is a golden apple inscribed "For the fairest," and Paris had to decide which of them most deserved it. Paris probably wanted desperately to refuse. Being asked to judge between divine beings felt like a trap, and indeed it was. But you don't refuse a direct request from Hermes carrying orders from Zeus. So Paris agreed, though he must have known nothing good could possibly come from this. The goddesses were not content to stand there passively and let him judge their appearances alone. Each of them tried to influence his decision with bribes, offering him gifts beyond mortal imagining if she chose her. The fact that they felt the need to bribe a mortal shepherd for his vote tells us something about the vanity and insecurity that even divine beings could feel. Hera went first, stepping forward with all her regal authority. "Choose me," she said, "and I will make you the most powerful king in the world. You will rule vast territories, command mighty armies, conquer nations. Kings across the earth will bow before your throne. Your name will be synonymous with power, and all men will envy your position." Athena made her offer next, appealing to different values. "Choose me," she said, "and I will give you wisdom beyond all other men, and victory in every war. You will be the greatest warrior of your generation, undefeated in battle. Your tactical genius will be studied for generations. Your name will live forever in song and story, as the mightiest hero of your age, wise in counsel and invincible in combat." Then Aphrodite stepped forward. She didn't offer power or wisdom or military glory. She offered something simpler, and to Paris in that moment, infinitely more appealing. "Choose me," she said, "and I will give you the most beautiful woman in the world. She will be yours completely, will love you with a devotion that transcends reason, and that love will be worth more than all the kingdoms and all the battles that have ever been or will ever be." Paris barely hesitated. He was young, ruled by his desires and his heart, more than by strategic thinking about power or practical considerations about wisdom. He awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite. In that single moment, the fate of Troy was sealed, though Paris didn't know it. Hera and Athena, furious at being rejected, insulted before a mortal, having their beauty judged inferior, became implacable enemies of Troy. From that day forward, they would work tirelessly toward the city's complete destruction. But Paris wasn't thinking about geopolitics or divine vengeance. He was thinking about Aphrodite's promise, the most beautiful woman in the world. Who was she? Where could he find her? Her name was Helen. She was the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. She was also, according to myth, the daughter of Zeus himself, and a mortal woman named Leda, born from an egg after Zeus seduced Leda in the form of a swan. From childhood, Helen's beauty had been a source of problems. Every eligible prince in Greece had courted her when she came of age. When she finally chose Menelaus, the rejected suitors were forced to swear an oath to protect her marriage, to come to Menelaus's aid if anyone ever tried to steal her away. This oath would prove crucial later. Aphrodite, having made her promise to Paris, now set about fulfilling it. She arranged for Paris to be recognized as a prince of Troy, for his true identity to be revealed, for him to be welcomed back into his father's house despite the old prophecy. She then prompted Priam to send Paris as an ambassador to Sparta, giving him a legitimate reason to be in Menelaus's court, in proximity to Helen. And then she did what she did best. She made Helen fall in love with Paris. Whether Aphrodite used her power to enchant Helen, giving her no real choice in the matter, or whether Helen was already unhappy in her marriage and simply needed an excuse, remains debated. Either way, when Paris prepared to leave Sparta to return to Troy, Helen went with him. She left her husband, her young daughter Hermione, her home, her position, everything she had built in Sparta, for a foreign prince she barely knew. It was the kind of obsessive, irrational act that looked like madness to outside observers, but was really just Aphrodite's power operating at full strength, desire overwhelming every other consideration. Menelaus, returning home to find his wife gone and taken to Troy, was predictably enraged. This wasn't just personal humiliation, though it was certainly that. It was also political disaster, a direct insult to his honor and his kingdom. He called upon all those princes who had sworn the oath, those rejected suitors who had promised to defend Helen's marriage. And they came, bound by oath and also, perhaps, motivated by their own reasons, old grudges and political alliances, and simple desire for glory. Agamemnon, Menelaus's older brother, and the most powerful king in Greece, took command of the assembled forces. It was the greatest military expedition ever organized in the Greek world. Over 1,000 ships carrying tens of thousands of warriors, all sailing for Troy, all because of one woman, and the goddess who had promised her to a shepherd prince in exchange for a golden apple. The Trojan War lasted 10 years. Thousands died on both sides, heroes and common soldiers alike. Cities were sacked, families destroyed, entire bloodlines ended. The suffering was immense. the destruction catastrophic. And through it all, Aphrodite protected her favorites as much as divine law allowed. She saved Paris multiple times when he should have died in single combat. She rescued Aeneas, her son, from certain death on the battlefield. She involved herself in the fighting in ways that gods normally avoided, getting personally invested in the mortal conflict because of her promise to Paris. At one point, she even entered the battlefield herself to protect Aeneas when he was wounded and cornered by Greek warriors. She scooped him up, intending to carry him to safety. But Diomedes, one of the Greek heroes, saw her and made a daring decision. He recognized that she was a minor goddess, not one of the war deities like Ares or Athena, who were genuinely dangerous in combat. And he decided to risk divine anger. He thrust his spear at her, and the bronze blade pierced her hand, drawing ichor, the golden blood of the gods. Aphrodite screamed and dropped Aeneas, clutching her wounded hand in shock and pain. She fled the battlefield immediately, her only thought to get away from this terrifying mortal who had actually wounded her. She found Ares and begged him for his war chariot so she could return to Olympus. Once there, she collapsed weeping into her mother Diona's arms, showing the wound, unable to believe that a mortal had hurt her. The other gods, particularly Hera and Athena, who were still furious about the golden apple, mocked her cruelly. This is what happens, they said, when a goddess of love tries to meddle in war. Stick to your own domain, to bedrooms and seduction, and leave actual fighting to those who understand it. Even Zeus, though more gentle in his rebuke, made it clear that she was forbidden from entering battle again. War was not her sphere, he told her. She should focus on what she was good at and leave the violence to others. Chastened and still in pain from the wound, Aphrodite agreed. But she didn't stop interfering in the war. She couldn't, not when her promise to Paris remained unfulfilled, not when her son and her favorite humans were in constant danger. She worked behind the scenes instead, whispering suggestions to Paris, clouding the judgment of Greek warriors, using her influence over desire and emotion to subtly shift the course of events. It wasn't enough. In the end, Troy fell, just as the prophecy had warned. The city burned, most of its men were slaughtered, and its women were taken as slaves. Helen survived and eventually reconciled with Menelaus, returning to Sparta, where they lived together until old age. Paris died during the war, killed by a poisoned arrow. Aeneas, as we've discussed, escaped to Italy and founded the line that would become Rome. And Aphrodite, watching the destruction her vanity and her promise had helped cause, felt something that goddesses rarely experience: regret. The Trojan War became the defining event of Greek mythology, the story that launched 1,000 other stories, the conflict that gave us Achilles and Hector, Odysseus and Ajax, all the great heroes whose names we still know today. And at its root, beneath all the politics and heroism and tragedy, lay a goddess's promise to a young man who just wanted to be loved. Aphrodite had offered Paris the most beautiful woman in the world, and she had delivered. But the cost of that gift was measured in burning cities, destroyed lives, and rivers of blood. Other lovers, many children. Aphrodite's romantic life extended far beyond Ares, Adonis, and Anchises. As goddess of love and desire, she had numerous affairs with both gods and mortals, each producing children who inherited aspects of their mother's nature and their father's power. These relationships paint a picture of a goddess whose appetites were diverse, and whose influence spread through divine offspring across the pantheon. With Hermes, the messenger god, she conceived a child whose very name reveals their unique heritage, Hermaphroditus. Born to be strikingly beautiful, inheriting good looks from both divine parents, Hermaphroditus was raised as a boy in the caves of Mount Ida by nymphs. But the story takes an unusual turn. When he was around 15, he traveled to Caria in Asia Minor and came to a clear spring where a water nymph named Salmachus lived. Salmachus saw the beautiful youth and fell instantly, overwhelmingly in love. She approached him, tried to seduce him, offered herself to him with a directness that shocked the innocent young Hermaphroditus. He rejected her advances, told her to leave him alone, and tried to depart. But Salmachus, desperate not to lose him, prayed to the gods that they might never be separated. Her prayer was answered, though not in any way she expected or wanted. Their bodies merged, becoming a single being with both male and female physical characteristics. Hermaphroditus became the deity of those born with features of both sexes, representing the fluidity and complexity of gender and physical form. From her union with Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and divine madness, Aphrodite bore several children. Priapus was perhaps the most notable, though his story is tinged with both humor and sadness. He was born with enormously oversized genitalia, a permanent erection that made him both ridiculous and frightening. Some sources attribute this condition to a curse from Hera, who was angry at yet another illegitimate child appearing among the gods, another reminder of the constant infidelities that characterized Olympian marriage. Despite his unfortunate condition, or perhaps because of it, Priapus became the god of fertility, gardens, livestock, and male genitalia. He was often depicted in a comical way, but he played a serious role in agricultural religion, guarding gardens and fields, ensuring crops grew and animals bred successfully. Aphrodite also bore the Graces to Dionysus, though other sources give them different parentage, showing how even ancient sources sometimes contradicted each other on divine genealogies. These were three sisters: Aglaea, whose name means splendor; Euphrosyne, meaning joy or mirth; and Thalia, whose name translates to abundance or good cheer. They became Aphrodite's constant attendants, dancing with her, adorning her, spreading her mother's influence of charm and beauty throughout the world. When Aphrodite bathed or dressed or prepared herself, the Graces were there to assist, adding layers of grace and refinement to beauty that already needed no enhancement. With Dionysus, she also bore Hymenaeus, the god of wedding ceremonies, hymns, and marriage celebrations. His name is the root of our word hymen, and he represented the transition from maiden to wife, from daughter to mother, all the ritual and emotional complexity that weddings encompassed in ancient society. With Poseidon, god of the sea, Aphrodite had children including Rhodas and Herophilus. Rhodas gave his name to the island of Rhodes, that sun-drenched Mediterranean island that became one of the wealthiest and most powerful city-states in the ancient world. Through these children with Poseidon, Aphrodite's influence extended even into the maritime realm, though the sea god's connection to her was less intense than her relationship with Ares. Among mortal lovers beyond Anchises and Adonis, there was Butes, one of the Argonauts who sailed with Jason in search of the Golden Fleece. When the Argonauts sailed past the island of the Sirens, those deadly creatures whose singing lured sailors to their deaths, Butes alone couldn't resist the call. He leaped from the ship and began swimming toward the Sirens and certain death. But Aphrodite, watching, was moved by his courage or his beauty, or perhaps simply by whim. She saved him, pulling him from the water before the Sirens could reach him, and carried him to Sicily, where he became her lover, and, in some versions, founded a settlement that bore his name. There was also the poet Phaon, whose story might be more legend than myth. According to the tale, he was an old, ugly boatman who ferried Aphrodite in disguise across a strait. As payment for his kindness, she gave him magical ointment that transformed him from an aged crone into a beautiful young man. Every woman in his city fell in love with him, including, some sources claim, Aphrodite herself. The poet Sappho supposedly loved him hopelessly, and leaped from the cliffs of Laphacida in despair when he didn't return her affection, though this story is almost certainly later invention rather than ancient belief. All these relationships, all these children scattered across the divine and mortal realms, paint a picture of a goddess whose nature was fundamentally about connection, about the bridge between separate beings, about the force that drives entities to join together, whether for a moment or a lifetime. Her offspring were as varied as love itself. Some, like Harmonia, represented balance and peace. Others, like Phobos and Deimos, embodied fear and terror. Some, like the Graces, personified joy and beauty, while others, like Priapus, represented the crude, uncomfortable aspects of fertility and sexual desire. Through her children, Aphrodite's influence spread across the entire cosmos, touching every domain, influencing every aspect of life that involved attraction, reproduction, or the emotions that accompany both. A goddess who punishes. But Aphrodite was not all gentle affection and gift-giving. Like all Greek deities, she had a vengeful streak, and she did not take kindly to those who rejected her worship, insulted her power, or violated the rules of love as she understood them. Her punishments were creative, devastating, and often involved turning her own powers against those who had offended her, making them victims of exactly the forces they had rejected or abused. The story of Hippolytus provides one of the clearest examples of Aphrodite's wrath and the terrible consequences that could follow rejecting her domain. Hippolytus was the son of Theseus, the famous hero who had killed the Minotaur and performed countless other great deeds. Hippolytus was handsome, athletic, skilled in hunting, and devoted to Artemis, the virgin goddess of the wilderness. He had sworn himself to chastity, rejecting all romantic and sexual relationships, dedicating his life entirely to hunting and worship of Artemis. In itself, this wasn't necessarily offensive. The Greek world had room for those who chose celibacy, who dedicated themselves to virgin deities. But Hippolytus didn't just abstain from love. He actively despised Aphrodite, called her worship base and degrading, described sexual desire as something disgusting that no decent person would indulge, and encouraged others to reject her as well. Aphrodite, hearing these insults, decided to teach him a brutal lesson about the power he so casually dismissed and mocked. She caused Phaedra, Hippolytus's stepmother and Theseus's current wife, to fall desperately, overwhelmingly in love with her stepson. Phaedra, a decent woman who had never entertained such thoughts before, suddenly found herself consumed with desire for a young man she had known since childhood. She tried to resist, knowing the relationship was impossible and wrong on multiple levels. But Aphrodite's power was too strong, the desire too overwhelming. Eventually, unable to bear the torment anymore, Phaedra confessed her love to Hippolytus, or her nurse did it for her, depending on which version you follow. Hippolytus was horrified, revolted, furious. He rejected her absolutely, calling her mad, disgusting, shameful, and an insult to his father and to decency itself. His words were harsh and probably accurate, but they drove Phaedra to despair. Humiliated beyond endurance, heartbroken by his rejection, she killed herself, hanging herself in her chambers. But before she died, she left a letter for Theseus, claiming that Hippolytus had raped her, or tried to, leaving false evidence of her stepson's guilt. Theseus, returning home to find his wife dead and a letter accusing his son of the worst possible crime, believed her final testimony. In his rage and grief, he cursed Hippolytus, using one of 3 wishes that Poseidon, his divine patron, had granted him. Poseidon sent a bull from the sea, a massive, terrifying creature that appeared on the road as Hippolytus was driving his chariot. His horses panicked, and Hippolytus was dragged to death, his body broken and torn by the chariot he could no longer control. The entire family was destroyed. Phaedra dead by her own hand, Hippolytus dead by his father's curse, Theseus left to learn too late that he had murdered his innocent son based on a false accusation. She showed similar ruthlessness toward Eos, the goddess of the dawn, that rosy-fingered deity who brought light each morning. Eos had made the mistake of sleeping with Eris, Aphrodite's lover. As punishment, Aphrodite cursed Eos to fall in love with mortal after mortal, ensuring that the dawn goddess would always be chasing after human men, always being left behind as they aged and died, while she remained eternally young. It was a subtle curse, turning Eos into a figure of perpetual longing, never able to achieve lasting love, always starting over with someone new who would inevitably disappoint or leave or simply die of old age. The curse made Eos's immortality a burden rather than a gift. The story of Myrrha, which we discussed earlier in the context of Adonis's birth, shows another aspect of Aphrodite's vengeful nature. Because Myrrha's mother had boasted that her daughter was more beautiful than the goddess, or because Myrrha herself had neglected Aphrodite's worship, the goddess cursed the girl with incestuous desire for her own father. The entire tragic chain of events that led to Adonis's birth started as Aphrodite's punishment for human pride or neglect. The punishment was so severe, so beyond normal consequences, that it demonstrated the absolute power Aphrodite wielded, and her willingness to destroy lives to make her point. The propoetes, women of Cyprus who denied Aphrodite's divinity entirely, claiming she was not a real goddess or that she didn't deserve worship, were transformed into the first prostitutes as punishment. They were forced to offer themselves to any man who wanted them, their bodies becoming the very instrument of the worship they had rejected. It was Aphrodite's way of saying that you can reject her power consciously, but it will claim you anyway, often in the most degrading way possible. When a mortal princess named Psyche was proclaimed more beautiful than Aphrodite, people began worshipping the girl instead of the goddess, leaving Aphrodite's temples empty while crowds gathered to admire Psyche. Enraged by this displacement, Aphrodite sent her son Eros to make Psyche fall in love with the ugliest, most degraded creature he could find. The plan backfired when Eros himself fell for Psyche and eventually married her. But the intent was clear. Aphrodite would not tolerate rivals, mortal or divine, and she would use her power to destroy lives to make her point in matters of beauty and desirability. These stories of punishment serve an important function in understanding Aphrodite's character. She was not a gentle fairy godmother figure who granted wishes and spread happiness. She was a powerful, prideful deity who demanded respect and proper worship. Love and desire, in the Greek understanding, were not always kind. They could be destructive, obsessive, tragic. And the goddess who embodied these forces reflected all their aspects, light and dark together. To reject her was to reject fundamental parts of human experience, and such rejection always came at a terrible price. The sacred temples and the worship that never ceased. Throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, Aphrodite was worshipped with a devotion that bordered on obsession. Her temples were centers of religious practice, pilgrimage destinations, and focal points of community life. Understanding where and how she was worshipped tells us much about how ancient people understood love, beauty, fertility, and the divine. Her most important cult center was Cyprus, particularly the city of Paphos on the southwestern coast of the island. According to legend, this was where Aphrodite had first come ashore after her birth from the sea foam, where she had taken her first steps on dry land. The Temple of Aphrodite at Paphos dated back to the 12th century before the Common Era, making it one of the oldest continuously used religious sites in the entire Mediterranean world. Pilgrims traveled from across the known world to worship there, to seek the goddess's blessing in matters of love and fertility, to offer sacrifices and prayers, to participate in mysteries that we know little about today, because initiates were sworn to secrecy. The Paphos temple was unusual in several important respects. Unlike most Greek temples, which housed elaborate anthropomorphic statues of the deity, the original sacred object at Paphos was a conical stone, possibly a meteorite, representing the goddess in abstract rather than human form. This reflected the temple's Eastern origins and connections. The worship practiced there combined Greek and Phoenician elements, acknowledging Aphrodite's connection to earlier Near Eastern goddesses like Astarte and Ishtar. The rituals were ancient, predating Greek colonization of the island, reaching back to a time when the distinction between Greek and Phoenician religion was less clear. The priests at Paphos, called the Signoridei, traced their lineage back to Cinyras, who, in mythology, was both a king of Cyprus and the incestuous father of Adonis. These priests wielded considerable power, controlling not just religious ceremonies, but much of the economic and political life of the region. The temple received donations from worshippers, profits from the associated pilgrimage trade, fees for special prayers and sacrifices, and apparently owned considerable agricultural land and property. Being a priest at Aphrodite at Paphos was not just a religious position, but a path to wealth and influence. At Corinth, the Greek city that controlled the narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to the mainland, Aphrodite's temple on the Acrocorinth, the steep hill overlooking the city, was famous and controversial. Ancient sources, particularly Strabo the geographer, claimed that more than 1,000 women worked as sacred prostitutes in the temple, hierodules, or sacred slaves, offering their sexual services as a form of worship to the goddess. Modern scholars debate whether this actually happened, or whether it was anti-Corinthian propaganda spread by Athens, Corinth's great rival, designed to paint them as decadent and immoral. The debate continues, but what's undeniable is that the association between Aphrodite, sexuality, and prostitution was strong enough that the connection seemed plausible to ancient audiences. Regardless of whether sacred prostitution occurred on the scale reported, the temple at Corinth was wealthy and influential. Corinth was a major port city, a crossroads between eastern and western Greece, controlling trade routes by both land and sea. The temple benefited from the constant flow of sailors, merchants, and travelers who stopped to worship, make offerings, or simply to see the famous temple. The city's reputation as a center of pleasure and vice, whether deserved or exaggerated, made it nearly synonymous with Aphrodite's earthier aspects. In Athens, Aphrodite had several temples and shrines representing different aspects of her nature. The temple of Aphrodite Pandemos on the southwest slope of the Acropolis was said to have been founded by the legendary hero Theseus. The epithet Pandemos, meaning common to all the people or of all the people, represented Aphrodite's role in civic unity and social cohesion, not just personal desire. This was Aphrodite as the force that bound communities together, that created social bonds through marriage alliances and family connections. Athens also honored Aphrodite Urania, the heavenly Aphrodite, in a separate temple. This aspect of the goddess represented higher spiritual love, contrasting with the more earthy Pandemos. The distinction was philosophically important, especially to thinkers like Plato, who used it to discuss different types of desire and love in their works. But for most ordinary worshippers, the distinction probably mattered less than simply seeking the goddess's favor in whatever form was most accessible. The Aphrodisia, the major festival dedicated to Aphrodite, was celebrated annually in midsummer across the Greek world. The exact details varied by city and region, but common elements included the purification of the goddess's temples using dove blood, sacred birds being sacrificed on the altar, processions carrying images of Aphrodite through the streets, offerings of flowers, particularly roses and myrtle, burning of incense and perfumes, and communal feasting. In Cyprus, the celebrations included unique local elements like offerings of salt from the sea, emphasizing Aphrodite's connection to the maritime realm, and phallic-shaped bread, representing fertility and the generative powers the goddess controlled. The Adonia, the festival specifically mourning Adonis, was celebrated primarily by women and gave them a rare opportunity for public religious expression. They would plant gardens of Adonis in shallow containers, quick-growing seeds that would sprout rapidly and die just as fast, representing the youth's brief life and beauty. They would place these gardens on rooftops where the sun would beat down on them, hastening both their growth and their withering. When the plants died, the women would mourn publicly, wailing and crying out their grief in the streets, beating their breasts, tearing their clothes, engaging in rituals of mourning that were otherwise typically reserved for actual deaths in families. The festival gave women space to express grief and solidarity outside the usual constraints that Greek society placed on female emotional expression. Worshippers offered Aphrodite a variety of gifts depending on what they sought from her. Flowers, particularly roses and myrtle wreaths, were common offerings, representing beauty and love. Small birds, especially doves, were sometimes sacrificed, their blood used in purification rituals, though some temples forbade blood sacrifice to Aphrodite, preferring incense, perfumes, and wine libations. Women dedicated mirrors, jewelry, combs, and clothing to the goddess, asking for help in maintaining their own beauty and attractiveness. They offered perfume bottles and cosmetic containers, all the tools of making oneself desirable. Prostitutes, both independent and enslaved, considered Aphrodite their patron and made regular offerings to her, seeking protection in their dangerous profession and prosperity in their business. This association wasn't considered automatically shameful in Greek culture. Sexuality and its commercial expression were seen as falling under Aphrodite's domain, and those who worked in that sphere naturally sought her favor, just as merchants sought Hermes' blessing or soldiers honored Ares. Young brides made offerings to Aphrodite before their weddings, asking for her blessing on their marriages, for passion to coexist with the duty of producing heirs, for their husbands to remain attracted to them despite the physical changes that childbirth would bring. Married women sought her help in conceiving when nature seemed reluctant, in maintaining their husbands' affections against younger competition, in navigating the complicated emotional landscape of marriage in a society where love matches were rare and political alliances were common. When the Romans absorbed Greek culture and religion, they identified Aphrodite with their own goddess Venus. Originally, Venus had been a fairly minor Italian deity associated with gardens, springtime, and agricultural fertility. But after the connection with Aphrodite, she rose to become one of Rome's most important goddesses. The claim that Venus was the ancestor of the Roman people through Aeneas gave her a central place in Roman religion and political mythology that exceeded even her prominence in Greece. Julius Caesar built a temple to Venus Genetrix, Venus the Mother, in the Roman Forum, emphasizing his family's supposed descent from the goddess through Aeneas and his son Ilus. Later emperors continued this tradition, all claiming Venus as their divine ancestress, all using her name and cult to legitimize their power and authority. The temple became a political statement as much as a religious site, demonstrating how mythology and statecraft intertwined in the ancient world. The transition from Greek Aphrodite to Roman Venus shows how myths evolve and transform as they move between cultures, taking on new meanings and emphasis while retaining their essential character. Venus kept Aphrodite's associations with love, beauty, and desire, but gained additional importance as mother goddess, ancestral deity, and guarantor of Roman destiny. The legacy that lives forever. We are nearing the end of this long journey through Aphrodite's story. But before we close our eyes to sleep, it's worth considering how this ancient goddess continues to influence our world millennia after her last temple fell silent, after the final priest spoke her name in ritual, after worship of the Olympian gods faded into history and memory. The word aphrodisiac comes directly from her name, referring to any substance believed to arouse sexual desire. Every time someone mentions oysters or chocolate or certain spices as aphrodisiacs, they're invoking an ancient goddess without necessarily knowing it. That linguistic connection reminds us that for all our modern sophistication and scientific understanding, we still reach for ancient divine names when discussing fundamental human experiences that science hasn't fully explained or controlled. In art, Aphrodite has inspired countless works across the centuries, in every medium artists have invented. The Venus de Milo, that famous statue with missing arms, discovered on the Greek island of Melos and now housed in the Louvre in Paris, was carved in the 2nd century before the Common Era, and still draws crowds of viewers who marvel at how the unknown sculptor captured idealized beauty in cold marble. Botticelli's Birth of Venus, painted during the Italian Renaissance, depicts Aphrodite on her scallop shell, being blown to shore by wind gods, and it remains one of the most recognizable and reproduced images in all of Western art. Countless other painters, sculptors, poets, and artists have tried to capture her essence, each adding their own interpretation to the growing collection of Aphrodite images. She appears in medieval manuscripts, Renaissance paintings, neoclassical sculpture, romantic poetry, modern novels, and contemporary art installations. Each generation reimagines her according to its own understanding of beauty and desire, and each generation's interpretation tells us as much about that time period as it does about the goddess herself. In literature, she appears not just in ancient texts, but in modern works that reference, reimagine, or respond to her myths. Contemporary novelists have written from her perspective, explored her motivations, humanized her in ways the original myths never attempted. Some portray her as a victim of divine politics and patriarchal structures, trapped in an arranged marriage and punished for seeking her own happiness. Others present her as a force of nature, operating beyond human moral categories, neither good nor evil, but simply powerful and amoral. These reinterpretations keep her story alive, prove that the questions she raises about love, desire, beauty, and their consequences remain relevant to modern audiences. Psychologically, Aphrodite has become a symbol and archetype, for understanding aspects of human personality and behavior. Jungian analysts talk about the Aphrodite archetype, referring to people whose primary mode of relating to the world is through attraction, seduction, and emotional connection. Some celebrate this as a healthy embrace of sexuality and pleasure, a rejection of shame and repression. Others point to the potentially destructive aspects of obsessive desire and the pain that comes from defining yourself primarily through others' desire for you. Feminist scholars have had complex and sometimes contradictory relationships with Aphrodite. Some celebrate her as a goddess who wielded real power through her sexuality, who made even Zeus himself bow to her influence, who represented women's erotic agency in a deeply patriarchal culture. They point out that she was never punished for her affairs the way mortal women would have been, that she chose her own lovers freely, that she accumulated power and worship through gifts traditionally associated with women rather than through traditional male domains like warfare or governance. Others criticize her as fundamentally defined by and for male desire, more object than subject, representing a male fantasy of ideal womanhood rather than authentic female power. They note that her authority came from being desirable rather than from independent achievement, that her influence depended on inspiring desire in others rather than acting directly, that even her most famous exploits involved causing problems that men then had to solve through warfare and other traditionally masculine pursuits. Both interpretations have merit and aren't necessarily contradictory. Aphrodite was powerful within the constraints of her culture, yes, but those constraints were real and limiting. She could act on her own desires in ways denied to mortal women, but her power still operated primarily through traditional channels of feminine influence. She was both empowered and limited, both transgressive and traditional, both goddess and trapped by her divine role. Tourism to her ancient sites continues today. People still visit Paphos in Cyprus, walking among the ruins of her temple, standing on the beach where legend says she first came ashore from the sea foam. The site is now a UNESCO World Heritage location, protected and studied and visited by thousands every year. People visit Corinth, climbing the steep path to the Acrocorinth to see the foundation stones of her temple, and imagine what it must have been like when pilgrims made the same climb 2,000 years ago. These visits aren't typically religious in the ancient sense. Few modern visitors actually pray to Aphrodite or make offerings at her altars. But there's often something reverent in how people approach these ruins, an acknowledgement that these stones once meant something profound to people, that the goddess worshipped here represented forces and experiences that still move human hearts today. The sites have become pilgrimage destinations for lovers, people seeking to celebrate their relationships in a place dedicated to love, continuing the tradition of seeking Aphrodite's blessing, even in a world that no longer believes in her literal existence. And in everyday life, we still invoke her spirit and her domains, even if we don't use her name. Every time someone says love makes us irrational, that's Aphrodite's influence being acknowledged. Every time we recognize that physical beauty has power, independent of virtue or wisdom or other qualities, that's an admission of Aphrodite's domain. Every time we celebrate desire as a life-affirming force rather than something to be repressed or ashamed of, we're engaging with ideas that the ancient Greeks explored through her myths and worship. She represented a fundamental truth about human existence, that we are not purely rational creatures, that we are driven by desires we don't fully control or understand, that love and lust and longing can override our better judgment and lead us to both transcendent joy and devastating ruin. The ancient Greeks understood this, felt it in their own lives, and created a goddess to embody and explain these forces. We still live with those same forces today, feel them just as intensely, struggle with them just as much. And so, Aphrodite, in a very real sense, still lives, still influences, still matters. The eternal goddess. And so we come to the end of a very long story, a journey that began in sea foam and divine violence, that wound through countless love affairs, tragedies, and wars, and worship practices, and that Aphrodite was many things, often contradictory things, lover and avenger, nurturing mother and jealous destroyer, blessing and curse, the most beautiful and the most dangerous. She could inspire the highest forms of love and the darkest forms of obsession. She could create harmony between enemies or tear apart families that had stood for generations. She embodied contradictions because love itself is contradictory, because desire doesn't follow neat logical paths, because beauty can be both elevating and destructive, often in the same moment. The Greeks, in their wisdom, didn't try to make her simple or resolve her contradictions into some unified character. They let her be complex, let her contain multitudes, acknowledged that the forces she represented operate beyond easy moral categories. A sunset is beautiful whether it illuminates a wedding or a massacre. Desire can lead to the creation of new life or the destruction of everything we value. Beauty can elevate the soul or trap it in shallow materialism. Aphrodite encompassed all of it. Her story reminds us that love is powerful, unpredictable, sometimes cruel, and always transformative. Whether she was born from castration and sea foam or from a more conventional divine pregnancy doesn't matter as much as what she represents. The force that makes us reach out to another person, that makes us vulnerable, that drives us to risk everything for connection and intimacy. The drive toward union that creates families and societies, but can also destroy them when it goes wrong or becomes obsessive. She walks through these stories making gods and mortals fall in love, manipulating emotions and desire. And in her wake come children, wars, great art, soaring poetry, joy, grief, all the things that make life worth living and unbearably painful sometimes, in the same breath. The rose with its thorns, the dove that mates for life but can carry disease. The beautiful shell that protects soft, vulnerable flesh inside. All of it, Aphrodite. All of it, the reality of love and desire in a world where nothing perfect lasts and everything beautiful eventually fades or transforms into something else. The ancient hymns said she has power over all living things, over the birds in the air and the beasts in the field, over the fish in the sea and the humans walking the earth, over even the gods themselves in their golden palaces. And that power, which the Greeks called eros, and which we might call desire or attraction or the life force itself, continues to move through the world today just as it did 3,000 years ago, creating and destroying, bringing together and tearing apart, as inexorable and unpredictable as the waves that brought Aphrodite to shore in the beginning. If you've stayed with me through this entire long journey, from birth to worship, from tragedy to triumph, from ancient temples to modern influence, from sea foam to today, I hope these stories have given you something to carry into your dreams tonight. Perhaps an appreciation for how our ancestors understood love and desire and beauty. Perhaps a sense of connection to people thousands of years dead who felt the same confusing tangle of emotions we feel today when we fall in love or desire someone or simply see something so beautiful it makes us catch our breath. Perhaps just the gentle rhythm of an old story well told. The kind of narrative humans have been sharing since we first learned to speak, meant to be heard as consciousness fades and sleep approaches. If you enjoyed this exploration of Aphrodite's story, if these ancient tales brought you any peace or wonder, or simply helped you relax, I'd be grateful if you'd like and subscribe to help this channel continue sharing the quiet stories of history and myth. Leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is as you drift off to sleep. There's something deeply comforting in knowing that across the world, people are falling asleep to the same old stories, finding rest in narratives that have outlived empires and civilizations, that have survived the fall of the gods they describe. Sweet dreams to you. May you find what Aphrodite offered her most beloved, a moment of perfect beauty, connection that transcends words, and love in whatever form speaks most deeply to your heart. The Greeks, in their wisdom, understood that love is powerful, unpredictable, sometimes cruel, and always transformative. Remember that as you sleep tonight. Remember that humans have always loved and hoped and reached for each other across the darkness and the distance. Remember that desire has always... Aphrodite was many things, often contradictory things. Lover and avenger, nurturing mother and jealous destroyer, blessing and curse, the most beautiful and the most dangerous. She could inspire the highest forms of love and the darkest forms of obsession. She could create harmony between enemies or tear apart families that had stood for generations. She embodied contradictions because love itself is contradictory, because desire doesn't follow neat logical paths, because beauty can be both elevating and destructive, often in the same moment. The Greeks, in their wisdom, didn't try to make her simple or resolve her contradictions into some unified character. They let her be complex, let her contain multitudes, acknowledge that the forces she represented operate beyond easy moral categories. A sunset is beautiful whether it illuminates a wedding or a massacre. Desire can lead to the creation of new life or the destruction of everything we value. Beauty can elevate the soul or trap it in shallow materialism. Aphrodite encompassed all of it. Her story reminds us that love is powerful, unpredictable, sometimes cruel, and always transformative. Whether she was born from castration and sea foam or from a more conventional divine pregnancy doesn't matter as much as what she represents. The force that makes us reach out to another person, that makes us vulnerable, that drives us to risk everything for connection and intimacy. The drive toward union that creates families and societies but can also destroy them when it goes wrong or becomes obsessive. She walks through these stories making gods and mortals fall in love, manipulating emotions and desire, and in her wake come children, wars, great art, soaring poetry, joy, grief, all the things that make life worth living and unbearably painful sometimes in the same breath. The rose with its thorns, the dove that mates for life but can carry disease, the beautiful shell that protects soft, vulnerable flesh inside. All of it, Aphrodite, all of it, the reality of love and desire, in a world where nothing perfect lasts and everything beautiful eventually fades or transforms into something else. The ancient hymns said she has power over all living things, over the birds in the air and the beasts in the field, over the fish in the sea and the humans walking the earth, over even the gods themselves in their golden palaces. And that power, which the Greeks called eros, and which we might call desire or attraction, or the life force itself, continues to move through the world today, just as it did 3,000 years ago, creating and destroying, bringing together and tearing apart, as inexorable and unpredictable as the waves that brought Aphrodite to shore in the beginning. If you've stayed with me through this entire long journey, from birth to worship, from tragedy to triumph, from ancient temples to modern influence, from sea foam to today, I hope these stories have given you something to carry into your dreams tonight. Perhaps an appreciation for how our ancestors understood love and desire and beauty. Perhaps a sense of connection to people thousands of years dead who felt the same confusing tangle of emotions we feel today when we fall in love or desire someone or simply see something so beautiful it makes us catch our breath. Perhaps just the gentle rhythm of an old story well told, the kind of narrative humans have been sharing since we first learned to speak, meant to be heard as consciousness fades and sleep approaches. If you've enjoyed this exploration of Aphrodite's story, if these ancient tales brought you any peace or wonder or simply helped you relax, I'd be grateful if you'd like and subscribe to help this channel continue sharing the quiet stories of history and myth. Leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is as you drift off to sleep. There's something deeply comforting in knowing that across the world, people are falling asleep to the same old stories, finding rest in narratives that have outlived empires and civilizations, that have survived the fall of the gods they describe. Sweet dreams to you. May you find what Aphrodite offered her most beloved, a moment of perfect beauty, connection that transcends words, and love in whatever form speaks most deeply to your heart. The goddess of desire has left our temples. Her priests have been silent for almost 2,000 years. But she's moved into our collective imagination, into our language and our art and our deepest hopes. She's still there, in the catch of breath when you see someone beautiful, in the racing heart when desire strikes, in the willingness to risk everything for love, even when you know it might destroy you. Remember that as you sleep tonight. Remember that humans have always loved and hoped and reached for each other across the darkness and the distance. Remember that desire has always been part of what makes us human, that beauty has always moved us, that the complications Aphrodite embodied are the same complications we navigate every day. And rest well, knowing that story continues, will always continue, as long as hearts still beat and people still dream of being loved and being beautiful and mattering to someone. Sleep well. Dream of roses and sea foam and the kind of love that the ancient Greeks understood was worth building temples for, worth sailing 1,000 ships to reclaim, worth every beautiful, terrible consequence it could bring. Sleep well.